The Second Stadtholderless Period or era is the designation in Dutch historiography of the period between the death of Stadtholder William III on March 19, 1702 and the appointment of William IV as Stadtholder and Captain General in all provinces of the Dutch Republic on May 2, 1747. During this period the office of stadtholder was left vacant in the provinces of Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht, though in other provinces that office was filled by members of the House of Nassau-Dietz during various periods. During the period the Republic lost its great power status and its primacy in world trade, processes that went hand in hand, the latter causing the former, though the economy declined considerably, causing deindustralization and deurbanization in the maritime provinces. A rentier-class kept accumulating a large capital fund that formed the basis for the leading position the Republic achieved in the international capital market. A military crisis at the end of the period caused the fall of the state's party regime and the restoration of the stadtholder rate in all provinces. However, though the new stadtholder acquired near dictatorial powers, this did not improve the situation. Background. Historiographical note. The terms First Stadtholderless Period and Second Stadtholderless Period became established as terms of art in Dutch historiography during the 19th century, the heyday of nationalistic history writing, when Dutch historians wistfully looked back on the glory days of the Dutch Revolt and the Dutch Golden Age and were looking for scapegoats for what went wrong in later years. Partisans of the new royal House of Orange-Nassau, like Guillaume Groen van Priester, who were indeed continuing the traditions of the Orangist party during the Republic, recast that history as a heroic narrative of the exploits of the stadtholders of the House of Orange. Anybody who had stood in the way of those stadtholders, like the representatives of the States Party, eminently fitted the role of bad guys in these romantic stories. Johan van Oldenbarneveld, Hugo Grotius, Johan de Witt, though not actually demonized, got decidedly shorter shrift than later historians were prepared to do. The lesser-known regions of later years even fared worse. John Lothrop Motley, who introduced Americans to the history of the Dutch Republic in the 19th century, was strongly influenced by this point of view. The general gist of the narrative was that as long as the stadtholders led the country, all was well, whereas when such heroic figures were replaced with the humdrum regions, the ship of state inexorably drifted to the cliffs of history. Superficially, the Orangist historians seem to have a point, because both stadtholderless periods arguably ended in disaster. The negative connotation of the term therefore seemed well-deserved. However, other historians put question marks next to the causal process that the Orangists postulated. However this may be, one could ask whether an emotionally and politically loaded term like this is still appropriate as a historical label in the task of historical periodization, apart from the fact that long persisting use in common parlance has established such a right to exist. That question may be answered in the affirmative, because as it turns out, the absence of a stadtholder was indeed a principle of the constitution of the Republic in these historical periods. It was the cornerstone of de Witt's true freedom, the ideological underpinning of his state's party regime during the first period, and would be revived as such during the second period. The renowned 19th-century Dutch historian Robert Fruin uses the arguably more appropriate term stadtholderless regime for the periods, to emphasize the fact that we are not just concerned with a label, but that there was something in the historical situation that gives the historical circumscription stadtholderless period meaning. The stadtholderate of William III. The popular revolt in reaction to the French invasion of 1672, during the Franco-Dutch War, had overturned the States Party regime of Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt and swept William III. Of Orange into power. He was appointed stadtholder in Holland and Zeeland in July 1672, and received powers that went far beyond those of his predecessors. His position was made impregnable when the States General of the Netherlands authorized him in September 1672 to purge the city governments of major Holland cities from regions of the States Party, and replace them with adherents of the Orangist faction. His political position was further consolidated when the office of stadtholder was made hereditary for his putative descendants in the male line in Holland and Zeeland in 1674. At the readmission of the provinces that had been occupied by the French in 1672 to the Union after 1674, those provinces had to pay a political price in the form of the so-called regeringsreglementen that William imposed on them. These may be compared to organic laws that gave him the right to appoint most officials on the provincial level in these provinces and to control the election of city magistrates and magistrates in the countryside. Many have erroneously interpreted these developments as the office of the stadtholder becoming monarchical. Quote, that would be a misunderstanding, however, even though the court of the stadtholder took on a decidedly princely aspect. If William was a monarch at all, it was a constitutional one, with still sharply limited powers, formally and politically. The States General remained sovereign in the Republic, the entity with which other states concluded treaties and made war or peace. The pretensions to sovereign supremacy of the provinces, however, as under the de Witt regime, were again replaced with the constitutional theory of Maurice, Prince of Orange, after his overturning of the regime of Johan van Oldenbarnevelt in 1618, in which the provinces were at least in certain respects subservient to the Generality. The new, extended prerogatives of the stadtholder mostly regarded his powers of patronage, and these enabled him to build a strong power base. But his power was in large manner checked by other centers of power, especially the states of Holland and the city of Amsterdam within the province. Especially that city was able to obstruct William's policies if they were perceived to conflict with its interest. But if they coincided, William was able to forge a coalition that could override any opposition. This was demonstrated, for instance, in the summer months of 1688 when Amsterdam was persuaded to support the invasion of England, which later led to the Glorious Revolution and William and Mary's accession to the British thrones. Nevertheless, these developments were a result of William's persuasive powers and skill in coalition building, not from his exercise of monarchical powers. Though commander-in-chief of the Republic, William could not simply order the invasion, but needed the authorization of the States General and the States of Holland. On the other hand, the events of the 1690s helped to bring about a grand consensus in the Dutch Republic around the foreign policy, centered on opposing the designs of Louis XIV of France and maintaining a close alliance with the former arch-enemy England. Also, when it became clear toward the end of William's life that the country would after his death be governed by someone who would not necessarily put the interests of the Republic first. This grand consensus, however, was not the product of slavish sycophancy of courtiers, but of a genuine intellectual agreement in Dutch government circles that this was the right policy to follow, at least in the foreign policy field. It did not necessarily extend to the domestic policy field in all respects, and this may explain the course of events after William's sudden death in early 1702. The complicated succession of William III in his regnal titles and possessions. When he died, William was King of England, Scotland and Ireland. succession, but the Bill of Rights 1689 and the Act of Settlement 1701 firmly placed the succession in these kingdoms in the hands of his sister-in-law and cousin Anne. The succession to his other titles and offices was not that clear, however, as William died without issue. He had to make provisions in his last will and testament to prevent any uncertainty. Indeed, he made John William Fraser, Prince of Orange, head of the cadet branch of Nassau-Dietz of the family, his general heir, both privately and politically. There was doubt, however, if he had the authority to dispose of the complex of titles and lands connected with the title Prince of Orange, as he saw fit. As he undoubtedly knew, his grandfather Frederick Henry had made a fideicommis in his will that established cognatic succession in his own line as the general succession rule in the House of Orange. This provision gave the succession to the male offspring of his eldest daughter Louise Henriette of Nassau in case his own male line would become extinct. Such an entailment was quite common in aristocratic circles, to ensure the integrity of the inheritance. The problem was that an entailment in general view limits the power of the possessors of the entailed inheritance to dispose of it as they see fit. William probably intended to override this provision, but the entailment made his will vulnerable to dispute, and disputed it was, on the ground that it clashed with Frederick Henry's entailment by the beneficiary of that entailment, Louise Henriette's son Frederick I of Prussia. But Frederick was not the only person who contested William's will. Frederick Henry's entailment happened to be the last in a long line of entailments by previous holders of the title Prince of Orange, beginning with René of Chalon, who had founded the dynasty by willing the title to his nephew William the Silent, the progenitor of most of the claimants. René had made an entailment that gave the succession to the female line of his nephew, in case the male line would become extinct. This overruled the agnatic succession apparently prevailing before this time for the title. It would be interesting to know who would inherit according to this rule, but apparently there was no claimant basing himself on it. However, Philip William, Prince of Orange, William the Silent's eldest son, made an entailment that would override René's entailment, restoring the agnatic succession, and giving it to the male line of John VI, Count of Nassau-Dillenburg, William the Silent's brother. As it happened, the beneficiary of this provision was one William Hyacinth of Nassau-Siegen, who also vigorously contested the will in 1702. To complete the confusion, Maurice, Prince of Orange, Philip William's half-brother, made an entailment that would give the succession to the male line of Ernst Casimir of Nassau-Dietz, a younger son of John VI, and the progenitor of John William Fraser. This was the main claim to the inheritance of John William Fraser. All these claims and counterclaims set the stage for vigorous litigation, especially between Frederick of Prussia and Henriette Amalia van Anhalt-Dessau, the mother of John William Fraser, as the latter was still a minor in 1702. This litigation was to go on for 30 years between the offspring of the two main claimants, until the matter was finally settled out of court with the Treaty of Partition between William IV, Prince of Orange, John William Fraser's son, and Frederick William I of Prussia, Frederick's son, in 1732. The latter had in the meantime ceded the Principality of Orange to Louis XIV of France by one of the treaties, comprising the Peace of Utrecht, thereby making the matter of succession to the title rather immaterial. The remaining inheritance was shared between the two rivals. The import of this story is that young John William Fraser's claim to the title of Prince of Orange was contested during the crucial years immediately following William III's death, thereby depriving him of an important source of prestige and power. He already was stadtholder of Friesland and Groningen, as this office had been made hereditary in 1675, and he had succeeded his father Henry Casimir II, Prince of Nassau-Dietz, in 1696, be it under the regency of his mother, as he was only 9 at the time. He now hoped to inherit the office in Holland and Zeeland also, especially as William III had groomed him for the office, and had made him his political heir, and the office was hereditary. However, that provision had been contingent on a natural male heir for William III. The Holland regents did not feel bound by a testamentary provision. 9 days after William's death, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, Antony Heinsius, appeared before the States General and declared that the States of Holland had decided not to fill the vacancy of stadtholder in the province, the old patents from December 1650, conveying the prerogatives of the stadtholder in matters of election of magistrates to the city governments were once more put in force. Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland, Overijssel, and even Drenthe followed suit. The Regeringsreglementen of 1675 were retracted and the situation pre-1672 restored. The immediate effect was that regents from the old States Party faction were restored to their old positions at the expense of Orangist regents who had been appointed by William. This purge occurred generally peacefully in Holland, but in Zeeland, and especially Gelderland, there was sometimes long drawn-out civil unrest, which sometimes had to be suppressed by calling out the militia, or even federal troops. In Gelderland there was even a genuine democratic impulse behind this unrest, as the would-be newcomers availed themselves of the support of the common people who demanded the check by the pre-Habsburg councils of Gemeensleden, and generally of the representatives of militias and guilds, on the regent city governments, a development deplored by States Party and Orangist regents alike. Any inclination Holland and the other 4 provinces might have had to appoint Frisse as stadtholder probably was negated by the fraught international situation. A new conflict with the France of Louis XIV was about to break out, and this was no time to experiment with a 15-year-old boy in such important offices as that of stadtholder and captain general of the Dutch States Army. Besides, the States General did not want to offend an important ally like Frederick I of Prussia, who had already in March 1702 occupied the counties of Lingen and Meuse and was not too subtly threatening to defect to the French side in the coming war if he were thwarted in his quest for his rightful inheritance. Heinsius and the War of Spanish Succession. Antony Heinsius had been head pensionary since 1689, almost as long as William III had been King of England. As William was busy managing his new subjects, the equally difficult task of managing the Dutch politicians back home was left to the capable hands of Heinsius, who shared much of William's genius for politics, and many of his diplomatic gifts. Those diplomatic gifts were also needed in keeping the grand coalition together that William had been able to form against Louis XIV during the 9 Years' War. It needed to be resurrected after the last will and testament of King Charles II of Spain, leaving the Spanish crown to Louis's grandson Philip after Carlos' childless death in 1700, threatened to upend the European balance of power, and diplomatic efforts to save that balance had failed. William spent his last year of life feverishly rebuilding the coalition with Austria, his nephew Frederick I of Prussia, and a host of smaller German princes to support the claim to the Spanish throne of Charles III, as a means of preventing a union of the power of Spain and France, which might overwhelm the rest of Europe. He was ably assisted in this effort by Heinsius and his English favourite, the Duke of Marlborough. These preparatory negotiations had all but been completed when William died on March 19, 1702 from complications after a fall off his horse. William's unexpected death threw the preparations into disarray. Would the Quiet Revolution, overturning the stadtholderate and reintroducing the States Party regime in the Republic, cause a rupture with England and the other allies? It seems there was never any danger of this, if only because the Republic was not about to break with the policies of the dead stadtholder in the foreign field, whatever they may have thought of his domestic policies. Moreover, the Dutch regents had their own reasons to join the coalition. In 1701, French troops had entered the southern Netherlands with the consent of the Spanish authorities, and had forced the Dutch to evacuate the barrier fortresses that they had acquired as recently as the Peace of Ryswick just to prevent such a French incursion. This eliminated the buffer zone the Dutch preferred between themselves and the French. More importantly, the French opened the Scheldt to trade with Antwerp in contravention of the peace treaty with Spain of 1648. Also, Dutch trade with Spain and the Spanish colonies seemed to be in danger of being diverted to French merchants in view of France's mercantilist policies. In 1701, the new Bourbon King Philip V transferred the Asiento, for instance, to a French company, whereas before the Dutch West India Company had in practice held this trade concession. In short, the Dutch had many economic reasons, beside the obvious strategic ones, to oppose Louis taking over Spain and its possessions. However, William's death did pose the problem that his position as undisputed military leader in the field was now vacant. At first it was proposed that Queen Anne's prince consort Prince George of Denmark would become generalissimo of the combined Dutch and English armies, but the Dutch preferred a competent general and managed to push Marlborough forward without hurting Anne and George's feelings too much. Appointing Marlborough Lieutenant Captain General of the Dutch army was preferred by the States Party regents, who trusted a foreign general in this position more than a domestic general. During the first stadtholderless period in the 1650s, they had played with the idea of appointing the French Marshal Turenne, though nothing came of it. In other words, Marlborough's appointment solved a political problem for them too. Besides, in a secret arrangement, Marlborough was put under the tutelage of Dutch deputies in the field with veto powers over his decisions. This would prove to be a source of constant friction in the campaigns to come, as these politicians tended to emphasize the risks to the Dutch troops of Marlborough's decisions over their evident strategic brilliance. This Dutch interest can be explained by the preponderant role of Dutch troop contingents in the Allied order of battle. The Dutch supplied about twice as many troops as the English in the Flanders theatre of war, a fact that somehow often has been overlooked in English historiography, and they also played an important part in the Iberian theatre. For instance, Gibraltar was conquered by a combined Anglo-Dutch naval and marine force and after that held in the name of Charles III by a joint force, until Britain acquired this strategic position for itself in 1713. Despite frictions with Dutch deputies and generals, Anglo-Dutch cooperation in the military and diplomatic field was usually excellent, thanks to the rapport between Heinsius and Marlborough. The former supported Marlborough during the clash with General Slangenberg after the Battle of Ypres and facilitated Slangenberg's removal. Despite his heroic status in Dutch public opinion, cooperation with other Dutch generals like Henry de Nassau, Lord Overkirk at the battles of Elixheim, Ramillies, and Oudenaarde, and later with John William Frissot at Malplaquet was much improved, as was the relationship with the Dutch deputies in the field, especially Sicco van Goslinge, Marlborough's and Prince Eugene of Savoy's successes in the field resulted in the southern Netherlands being mostly cleared of French forces in the course of 1708. A joint Anglo-Dutch military occupation of this country was now established in which the Dutch economic interest predominated. The Dutch sought partial compensation in this for the English economic predominance that the Allied operations in the Iberian Peninsula had brought about in Portugal and Spain. Like Portugal for Britain, the southern Netherlands were now transformed into a captive market for the Dutch. By restoring the favourable Spanish tariff list of 1680 to replace the recent French mercantilist measures, the Dutch also hoped to limit the prospective Habsburg control of the southern Netherlands and to transform it into an Austro-Dutch co-dominion by a new, improved form of the barrier provisions of the Treaty of Ryswick. Heinsius now offered Great Britain a guarantee of the Protestant succession in exchange for British support for a Dutch right to garrison whichever, and as many towns and fortresses in the Austrian Netherlands, as the States General wished for. This exchange of guarantees led to the Barrier Treaty of 1709. Under it, the Dutch had to send 6,000 troops to England to keep order at both the 1715 and 1745 Jacobite risings. By 1710 the war had, despite these Allied successes, turned into a stalemate. Both the French and Dutch were exhausted and yearning for peace. Louis was now embarked on an attempt to divide the Allies by dangling the prospect of a favourable separate peace before the noses of the Dutch. During the not-so-secret Geertruidenberg negotiations of the spring of 1710, Louis offered to accept the removal of his grandson Philip from the Spanish throne in favour of Charles III, in exchange for the Habsburg territories in Italy as compensation for Philip. He tempted the Dutch with the craved-for barrier in the Austrian Netherlands and a return to the favourable French tariff list of 1664 and other economic concessions. The Dutch government was severely tempted, but declined for a complex of reasons. Not only would such a separate peace be dishonourable in the view, but it would also earn them the enduring enmity of the British and Austrians. They remembered how difficult it had been to restore friendship with their allies after they had fallen for Louis' enticements at the Peace of Nijmegen in 1678 and left the friends in the lurch. They also remembered how often Louis had broken his word previously. The deal-breaker was that they expected Louis to turn on the Dutch after he had dealt with his other opponents. They would be friendless if that happened. Finally, despite Louis' offer to acquiesce in Philip's removal, he refused to actively participate in such a removal. The Allies would have to do it themselves. Heinsius and his colleagues saw no alternative to continuing the war.